We will see if we get Rageocratic today. I do like the idea of the Rageocratic method as opposed to the Socratic method.
Yeah.
We will see if we get Rageocratic today. All right, the YouTube live stream is on, and Tom texted us earlier, so he should be here shortly. Wow, you are really interesting visual there for a moment.
Well, yeah, I'm kind of sick. I just moved also, and um I'm going through a lot of tests. I have kidney failure as well, so
Ooh.
things have been going on. Um, I have allergies, so I took this pill, and it gets me drowsy. So yeah, that's why.
I'm glad you made it.
And I'm cold. I know it's not cold here because I have a heater, but I feel cold. It's part of
Chills.
Hmm? Yes,
Chills.
yes. Uh,
That is. Oh, I really appreciate your powering through.
um, I, I just saw an email from you, like from April,
Mhm.
asking me. I saw an email from you from April asking me about. Uh, can you imagine a truly open, non-vendor control AI that would be less biased than
Mhm.
hybrid algorithms? And I don't know what the answer. I just saw that, so I'm just thinking about it. But I also sent a video to the Datocracy Telegram thing.
Ah,
It's this guy who well, I don't think he invented AI, but he's one of the major.
yeah, one of the early figures in AI. Yeah.
Yeah, he has an AI. He has a company, AI Go AI something. Let me see. Where he kind of shits on AI because he says it's not. Well, a lot of people say AI is not AI. The name is have to change, but he also says that LLMs are not good. And he says, LLMs are not good. He
Well, so
says,
the classical AI people hate LLMs and have always hated machine learning, right? So that in itself is not a surprising fact,
uh,
right? The I mean, I guess Scott Alexander said it best is that every generation claims that the next generation it's all going to hell because of technology, and once every 400 years they're absolutely correct. Civilization dies,
mm,
more or less for the reasons that they predicted. But like with 9/11, everyone, whatever their current hobby horse is that they blame for society's ills, is the reason society dies. And it's a uh, even if it's true, it's not a terribly useful framing, right? And this is the ugly reality we live in. It's funny, I was doing a deep. This is a random tangent, but why not?
mm.
What so interestingly, one of the topics we decided not to why we focused on the Ukraine war a couple of months ago. But I have an uncle that's, he and I go back and forth, every now and then. And his perspective is that, all these problems would go away if we just got rid of the Jewish state. Very simple.
Mm.
So it's like, well, first of all, it's not like the Middle East was a peaceful place before any of this. Secondly, that's kind of a massive humanitarian catastrophe there. But thirdly, it's like, yeah, I feel bad for the Palestinians who kind of got the short end of the stick on a bunch of different deals. Um, and in general, uh, you know, disorganized indigenous people get the short end of a stick when faced with a industrialized, coherent Western power. Um, but like, it's really hard for me to get moral outrage at the way the Jews are treating the Palestinians when I'm sitting here in California on land we stole from the Spanish after they colonized it away from the Indians. And so I was asking, like, was there ever like, did the Indians have like, an honorable political system that was superior to ours? It's like, not really. They had stable boundaries that, they would that they had ways to conduct peace treaties, and they tended to be definitely better stewards of the land. But that's also because their economic model depended on that, right? And how much of what we call virtue is just awareness of the realities of your situation. And there were pacifistic tribes in Indian times, but that's because they lived in places nobody else really wanted to be at or could be at. Like if you're on top of a desert, in the middle of a desert on a high plateau, you can kind of get away with being pacifist, right? If you're in a fertile river delta, you kind of need to be militaristic or you're just going to get rolled over. And the punchline of all of this is that in a world of accelerating technological change, you can decry the speed of which things are going. But if you don't, buy guns when all your enemies have guns, you're kind of toast. And it's easy to see about all the things wrong with AI and LLMs, and they're all true. Just like all the things that my generation said about TV were all true. Just like everything that people said about the internet, in the late 90s and early 2000s was all true. But you can't turn back the clock by insisting that everyone else stop making forward progress. You have to deal with the world as it is.
Yeah,
And
and that puts you in a weird position, like morally, I'm not for the things that the Muslim people do, especially when it comes to women and all those things.
The Muslim people. Okay.
Yeah, but I am totally on their side when it comes to the Palestine versus Israel thing. I mean,
Mhm.
to me, Israel is in the wrong, but I
So,
said,
but like, let me understand how extremely you're on the Palestinian side. Do you support the idea that every Jew living in that area should be either evacuated or forced to live under Palestinian rule, forcibly if necessary? Are you like the from the river to the sea type of on the
I mean,
Palestinian side? Is that what you mean? Probably not. I don't think.
well, kind
Your
of,
sympathies
yes.
I can see
Like
are on.
well, I don't know. One of my moral things is like I hate bullying. I hate bullies.
Right.
Israel is a bully right now. Therefore, I cannot be in on the side when they come to when it comes to the it's like Einstein said, everything is relative. Like 100 years, some 100 years ago, I will be on the side of the Indians. Like, what are these English people, doing here or
Mhm.
Spanish, whatever? I will be on because I hate bullies. And yeah, right now I'm sitting like you in California. So I say, hey, Israel, you're terrible. But that's how we have this country here because for better or worse, and I think we've talked about this. Um, we ended up with this situation that we have. And now we can sit on our laurels trying to tell the Israelis, hey, you guys, you're a bully. You shouldn't do that. When they have been attacked, by Hamas and all that. Uh, so, I choose my position, um, but it alienates people who uh,
Like I don't disagree with your position. I'm trying to understand it. Let's go ahead and have the conversation now since we're on it, and this is being rageocratic here. Let's press into the rage. When you say you hate Israel and you take Palestinian side, do you mean that in the extreme sense, like my uncle, that therefore anyone who's on the Jewish side deserves to lose, even if it means, you know, ethnic cleansing of Jews from Palestine? Is that
mm, um, mm,
I assume you mean something less than that, but maybe you don't. I don't know.
um, conflicted, you could say. You can say, I mean, I'm in an infinite loop when it comes to that. I just
Yeah. Is it you don't like this is it. Like you don't like the fact that Israel is bullying Palestine. Absolutely understandable. Does that mean it's okay to bully Israel, to stop it? I suspect not.
I was I would like to say that like it is not, but then I see the Palestinian map in the last 50 years, how it has changed, and it has changed through bullying.
Right.
Right?
But would bullying Israel to stop that be morally okay in your book? Or like, can we find something short of bullying that would still try to make the situation better?
I think that would be the best answer. Something short of bullying. I don't know what that is,
Yeah,
but
but this is good. Let's draw a distinction between hating bullying versus hating bullies,
okay.
right? I think that's a useful distinction in that, like, well, I'm not a bully, but I have to do bullying things to protect others, so that's okay. Whereas you, when you do bullying things, it's because you're a bully and you deserve to be hated, right? That I think that sort of moral, there's a lot of moral posturing like that,
Mm.
um, which, it's not helpful for resolving conflict. It's like, okay, Israel is doing some horrible things. No question about it. I would like that to stop. I don't want to stop that by doing something equally bad or worse. And this gets back to the conversation we had before about, and this is probably not a bad segment in Rageocracy, right? I understand what Rageocracy is against, and there's a lot of worthy opponents on that list to be against. What is Rageocracy for? And have you made any progress in trying to articulate a set of values or get any sort of consensus from the list?
Well, when I was getting to doing that homework, I got distracted into doing the other one, the one with the presentation I sent you guys, uh the one with the presentation, the one
You have a presentation, right?
the
And then
because
that was last
I
month,
focus on the solution. Okay, let me
right?
focus on this thing. Let me get it out of my head and put it there.
Yeah.
So the yeah, I even had a in that solution. I didn't include it in the last version, the version that I shared with you, but I had I had Deocracy, DEIocracy or something. I had all
Hmm.
those things divided because I envisioned a, a an environment where you can plug in the things that you want. Like there's a base thing that is addresses private information and sharing information and and sharing knowledge. But then you can plug in your dictocracy, you can plug in your um, meritocracy, you can plug in your deology, deology, and you can plug in your radiology, radiology. Anyway, I was inventing a component that you can plug in. Hey, I want to have this group, and I want us to be datocratic. So I want us to follow all these things, the datocratic values, the datocratic code. I want us to follow that, and that by code I mean laws, uh, uh, first principles, ideals, all those things, and group in a thing that you can just plug in. Um, so I got all that off my system, but I didn't address what are the radiology values? I don't want to be like like a Trumpist kind of person that says, "Hey, trust me, I know better than you, and I'm the source of information, and I'll tell you, how this goes." Like uh,
You don't want to find a personality cult.
yeah, or people saying, "Oh, I know." Well, how do you define pornography? Well, I'll know it when I see it, you know,
Yeah.
because there are various, maybe two people kissing is pornography. Yeah, I don't know. It depends on where your values are. Um, so yeah, I didn't get to define all those things. Right now, they're like a feeling type situation. It's like, oh, I have all these things and I write all this stuff, but defining exactly those values, it is not easy. And I know
Yeah.
we get away with having this nebulous stuff so that people
Hmm.
say, oh, yeah, we have American values and we have all those things. But nobody,
Except Tom.
nobody yeah, has sat down and said, these are the values of the United States, and this is what we follow. No, and people say, oh, the American values say this and that. Well, you know, 10 people are in a room, and there are 50 versions of what American values are because they are not real. They're just imaginary. And
Yeah. What's worse is when people have a clear value. Um, like I went to a church service once where people were saying, what's wrong with this culture is people don't respect authority, and we've lost our respect for obeying God's law and for obeying the law and respecting policemen. And by the way, I'm so glad that we kept meeting during COVID in defiance of those illegitimate laws that our governor was imposing on the state. And it's like, probably in his own head, he was morally consistent. But the reality is um, that this was the other thing that I came up with when I was talking with PT was there was this period where you have social stability, not harmony, rituals. Medieval Europe had their treaties and the rituals, so that there was conflict, but there were acceptable means for resolving the conflict. So you could trust at the end of the conflict, you would smoke a peace treaty and people would take it seriously. You had these ritualized norms. But after the Reformation and the 40 Years' War, you entered this age of total war, where regardless of what you said or believed, if you felt you were at an existential risk, you would just fight to the death. And Napoleon marching his armies across Europe, World War One, to I guess Crimean War was sort of the low point that led the Red Cross and Florence Nightingale, and it's like, hey, let's agree, let's not be like horrific towards each other all the time. Have some, and what the thing that got us out of that period of just complete and total war was sort of emergent, resilient institutions that you could say like, hey, they're flawed, they're imperfect, but they give you a place where you can say like, hey, let's talk about this. Like it's not trivial, but it is certainly possible to imagine that Ukraine and Russia sitting down, agreeing to a bunch of terms that America and China both think are valid, and then being held accountable to following through on that. Because we have those sorts of multilateral institutions now. But the hard part is those institutions have to be resilient, right? Because otherwise they just get co-opted, as arguably the WHO was during COVID. And it's the same with our values. We can write down whatever values we say, but if we get really triggered, and the thing that's writing them down and enforcing that is not resilient, then it really means nothing. It just means this is how I like to think of myself until I get really angry, in which case all bets are off. Um, on my side, one of the things that I want to work through is the tension between Billy Graham and Martin Luther King Jr.
mm,
Like one of the real tragedies that the conservative Christianity is totally in denial about is that when Martin Luther King was doing the stuff he was doing to trying to get the vote for blacks and civil rights and all this sort of stuff, he often said, "What wounds us most is not the hatred of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." And he actually knew Billy Graham, and Billy Graham, tried to desegregate a lot of his crusades because he really cared about people coming to Jesus. But because by that same token, he refused to take a stand on civil rights or to stand with Martin Luther King Jr. because he didn't want to distract from his obligation to preach the gospel. And I want to, have AI help me synthesize a conversation where Martin Luther King says to Billy, you say that you're apolitical, but that's just because you're comfortable. If you guys get uncomfortable and something you care about gets threatened, you will be just as violent, if not more, you'll be just as activist and, anti-government, if not more so than we are. And I want Billy Gunn to say, yeah, you think you're just being sensitive and political action. But if you continue down this road, your followers will think that protests and marches can solve anything, and they won't care about social stability, and they will reject everything that you've ever stood for. And I would like them to have a dream where they both see our future, where both of their dire warnings came true, and then ask the question: was there a way that they could have come to a deeper understanding of themselves and each other, of where they were lying to themselves and pretending virtue, but assuming a lot of things? And if they could actually see each other's reality, could they come up with a better way forward? I don't know, because we haven't yet. But it's like AI, is like, in technology, like it's easy to see all the things that go wrong for the people you hate. It's much harder to see all the things that go wrong with the people you defend. And the and Tom, you've been sitting there very quietly. I don't know if you wanted to weigh in, but do you ever have this problem where people sit down in a room and they say, well, yeah, of course we should do this. This is obviously the logical thing to do. This is clearly in our best interest. And then they go off and do the exact opposite.
So,
Or once you get a bunch of people to sit down and go through the language process and define the goals and the IEMs, do people generally follow through on that?
well, there's a lot of passivity for various reasons afterwards, but doing the exact opposite is a bit strong. It's not my experience.
Okay, so sometimes they'll just do nothing.
Yeah, that's more likely. And there's a
Okay,
reason for that. There's they have their reasons, like they would get fired if they did anything.
right. So this is the interesting thing, right? Is interesting. I'm dealing with this personally as well. Is that there's let's just call it core identity. There's something about my core identity that I jealously guard. And that's different than what I think are my core values, right? So if my core identity is threatened, I will act in a way that defends my core identity, even if it's contrary to what I consider my core values. I like to think that in the olden days, people were more simple and brutal. Like the great expansion of the Americas is like, we have a manifest destiny. We are ordained by God, and whatever we have to do to the natives to, exterminate them so we can live is fine. But I think that's actually unfair. Like I was reading the history of slavery, and the Spanish talk about the black fly, about all the horrible things that happened in the Spanish conquest of the Caribbean or whatever. Um, and they claim with some justice that Queen Isabella and the Spanish royalty had very strict rules for how you're supposed to treat the natives. And just like the Queen Elizabeth and the British were horrified at the excesses of the East India Company, right? Which is why they nationalized and took over with Mountbatten. And it's not. I think it's too easy to say that that's just cheap hypocrisy and posturing. I think it's actually deep hypocrisy, is that they really do want to think of themselves as moral people who treat even their enemies fairly and have rules and boundaries for conduct. But when there's an enormous economic incentive to put a charitable interpretation on your friend's behavior, we just can't resist. We just turn a blind eye and find excuses and rationalize or uh, uh, self deceive so that we can maintain a good opinion of ourselves while tolerating horrible things. And if we actually want to create change, we have to find a way to surface those, like you said, like uh, I think we talked about this before, Tom, is do you have a section in language where you identify risks? And does anyone
all
know
over the place.
and where
All over the
where was
place.
where was the risk that if I implement this, I'll get fired, surfaced, and dealt with? Or not?
That's like a stakeholder value, not get fired. That's what it is in
Don't
language.
generally admit that in their initial goals assessment.
It might come up. I have had dramatic situations. Take a simple example. What's the American service for shuttling packages around? United Parcels or
UPS,
something?
FedEx, UPS or FedEx.
Yeah. So Kai and I were sent to UPX to, I don't know, maybe we thought to help them figure out a better IT system or something. We had terrible problems, and it turned out they were sure that we had been sent by management to spy on them and fire them. That's an example of, boy, that was it. That was all that counted, nothing else. And it was a misunderstanding. I mean, maybe the manager was going to fire him, but we weren't the agents.
Right.
I've had
and then they actually told you that? Did they actually tell you that eventually when you pressed?
Yeah, I was told very clearly that was
Okay, so
what
in that
was going
case, it
on.
was obvious. But like you
There's
mentioned the
another
example.
second case. We were working for the U.S. Army on an IT project, and we had tremendous resistance to change, and they quite frankly feared we were going to do something with downsize them, that all lose their jobs. And maybe they were, but that wasn't our mission. Our mission was to, sort out the IT system. Okay, so yeah, I mean, I've seen this existential threat to job in specific cases.
Right, but like in the specific case you mentioned before, where you had a plan, it seems like would make sense, and then nothing happens. You ask them why, and they say, "Well, actually, we're afraid if we pull this off, we'll lose our job."
Um, yeah, things do surface. Like once at McDonnell Douglas, I had a brilliant idea. I thought, having read some text on the subject of letting the workers give their freedom and stuff like that, I invited the actual factory builders of the airplanes. People went down in the depths of the airplanes with all the wires and stuff, to meetings with the engineers who were designing the interior. And the idea was that the factory people would tell them what a bad design they had. It made things too difficult to maintain and build. And I thought that was just brilliant. But the director, Mac, his name was, pulled me aside and said, I also think it's a great idea. It's a wonderful thing. We're going to do it sometime, but right now you can't do it. And I said, why not? He said, trade unions. So, they did not, trade unions did not like the idea of the workers getting together with the engineers. They put it this way, it required their permission to cross that line, and I didn't know that. That was very hidden for me. I thought, well, what a great thing. Everybody must be happy here. Not the trade union. You were challenging their authority in some way.
Right. And I thought it was going to be that the construction people were terrified that if they criticized an engineer and an engineer complained, that they would lose their job. I guess they have the union, and that's why they have the union to protect them from things like that.
Yeah.
And that's why it's
No,
really important that the union has
yeah. If so, I didn't hear it, but no, we were just crossing a cultural boundary there that, you didn't mix the workers and the engineers.
Right. And there's a reason for
stop.
that. It could be an archaic reason from the past, but it's still a reason. So what's fascinating I had some good news this last month is that we really turned a corner at our company and um, landed our biggest customer ever. And like, if we're still getting the payments finalized or whatever, but we've been like living on the edge of financial viability for a while, and this is really putting us over the top. But getting there was an excruciating process where, like, at one point, it looked like there were many, like, three different existential threats that like were rearing up, and a lot of it was honestly, um, let's call it the trade unions in our brain, the things that are there that were there for a reason to protect us, but make you terrified of trying certain things that could potentially make things way better, but undermine a long-standing belief. Like for me, just to be confessional about it, it's that my identity as a product manager is based on I keep my promises. Like I understand the problem, I understand the risks, I communicate them, and then I commit to shipping something. And if I fail, I do a postmortem and fall on my sword. And in exchange, I expect people to be honest with me about the inputs and to give me, space to execute. And that wasn't happening. And I was getting really frustrated and angry. And what I realized was that the proximate goal of keeping my promises really ought to be in the service of helping the team succeed. And if I'm ticking them off by being adamant about my need for information and my need to keep my promises, then I'm actually scaring them and they're not giving me the information I need. And so the identity I was holding on to was getting in the way of the behaviors that would actually get me the thing that I want. And we had a 3-hour session where I was like, I just need to confess that these are the traumas driving me. I did it badly, but at least I did it. And we were able to get through that. And getting people to be honest about what they actually want versus posturing by telling you what they think is the opening in a negotiation. Um, and or like, could you just do this one thing and that would solve everything without telling you what everything is, and then discovering there's 5 hidden assumptions, 3 of which are false. Right? This is where the gap between intention and execution is so large. And what's worse, and this is the thing that I'm always anxious about with language, and I think Ernest did a very vulnerable job of being honest about this. I have a feeling inside me that is deeply important, but the words are a pale shadow. And if I give you those words and you try to plan around that, I might be very unhappy with the result. And yet, what I love about Ernest is this deep rage, this deep feeling that things matter. And, I would love to find a way to justify our title, but also to think through, like, how do we create a space where we don't force people into, having to articulate, but that we help them elucidate what they want. And I thought we did a decent job of this with Ukraine, in that we had some strong feelings around it and we were able to articulate something that gave us a sense of optimism about how to move forward. And it's it certainly includes and requires codifying things, but it feels like there's something even deeper. And let me call it, for lack of a better term, confessional. Is if you can get people to actually admit the real reasons that let's call it a better one, the pre-mortem, right? If this fails, why would it have failed? Right? And if you can get people to be honest about, like, this planning process is great, but there's this one VP who hates change, and he will agree to this when we present it to him, and then he will sabotage it afterwards. The people will know this is true. They will very rarely say it.
I'd like to break in with a thought there.
Please.
as a young man, I was my mother's son. I was a revolutionary. You know, all the revolutionaries. You know, Berkeley knows a lot about this. Anyway, as I get older, I've observed the world and had more opportunity than most to see the world. You know, travel everywhere, work, all kinds of things. And so I've drawn a simple conclusion. The most we can really hope for in terms of world politics and things that Ernest would like to change, and dealing with our clients and then our fellow teams, is to nudge things forward inch by inch in a positive direction. Now, that's my EVO method, my evolutionary method, literally, is that. And if we can do that, we're actually doing the best that humans normally can do.
Right.
And
I
we
will,
should be happy with that.
I'll accept that with one slight tweak to the word. If you can ratchet things forward,
That's what I
because that
meant.
means you. Okay, that's what you meant.
That's what I meant.
Right, nudge. Because the problem
Literally,
with nudge is,
ratcheting, yeah.
okay, yeah, okay, good, right. So if we can agree on that definition of nudge,
Yeah, I wasn't picking my words carefully, but I now, by the way, ratcheting is an ideal, and nudging with some backward slippage might be a reality at some points. So the question then is, although we took 10 steps forward and 5 steps back, did we net make 5 steps progress? That's actually the interesting question.
Right, as opposed to
so I wouldn't insist on I wouldn't insist on a literal ratchet. I would insist on in the long term progress. Yeah,
right.
Because some of those steps will fail to a degree. You will analyze them, and you will do different things to try and make it better. And that's the learning process, and that's also very deeply embedded in my work.
Right. Yeah, I think the issue in world politics is that every time we make progress in one direction, it generates such a strong backlash that it gets mostly reversed, at least in terms of social cohesion. And that's where this is the thing, getting back to the Rageocracy. I have friends who are on the pro-life movement, but when you talk to people in the trenches and like some politician will make some big gesture in favor of them, he goes, I used to get really excited when something went our way and really upset when things went the other side's way. But I've learned over the years that, if someone does something that really favors our side, that's going to galvanize the other side to give more money, and it'll 4 to 8 years later it'll swing back in the other direction, possibly worse, and vice versa. If the other side does something horrible to us, we raise a lot more money, we get more friends and more support, and 4 years later, and that I think is the biggest concern I have about Rageocracy as a framing is that it's like goes back to the bullying thing. Is if you get really angry at what people are doing wrong and act in a way that makes the other side really angry, then I hate to say it, there's people there who are way better at getting angry and acting out their anger than you are. I'm not sure we want to normalize that behavior, not to mention the names of any current presidents.
Another structural thought: if you take a look at your net progress after a non-trivial amount of time, like 10 years, and say, have we really made some process, and can we lock it in? Have we locked it in or not? Now, let's just say, no, you've made no progress, or you've gone backwards, or you've made infinitesimally trivial symbolic progress, but it ain't worth all the effort and bloodshed. Now, if that be true, it signals that you need to change your architecture. I mean, go elsewhere with totally different ideas, kind of situation. But if you have made real progress that you're have to be reasonably happy with in the short term, I would say you're playing the game well. Continue until further notice. That's all we can hope for.
Right. I mean,
Anyway,
I would, yeah,
my view of
no,
life.
I think that's good. I mean, I think there's a difference between like making minimal progress that you've been able to ratchet in. That's impressive, right? If you do that for a couple of decades and you realize you're getting diminishing returns, you may still
Yeah,
have the same
yeah,
problem that you have to revisit,
sure,
right?
sure. That's
And
built into my Evo method, looking at the efficiency, the return on investment, and when it goes sour, it's time to pivot,
yeah,
or find another architecture or whatever you want to call it. Try something radically different. By the way, I have a little bit of nice news in this connection. I think I may have a lot's happened. I probably told you I had some connections with Ukraine, with a
yeah, you
group
shared
called
about that last.
that's right. Okay, so that gang has gotten even more serious. They in conversations they noted that what the uh, company that my son Kai is working with, graphmetrics.com,
Mhm.
which, by the way, has had similar problems to yours financially, now got paying customers and turned the corner, but it's been scary for a long time. So we know about that. I helped fund some of the keeping it going. Anyway, they I was talking to the guy and he said, you mean they can take in blueprints and intelligently decipher them like nobody can, you know?
Mm.
And I said, yeah. He said, well, I just visited a site where there were 200 engineers um, uh, doing new drone technology with prototypes. You can imagine how important that is for Ukraine. The Russians got wind of it, bombed the factory, killed the 200, and destroyed all the prototypes. Well, pretty dumb, I mean, all in one place. I mean, the Ukrainians do that to Russian groups. So how dumb can
Yeah.
you anyway? But I'm sure they've had a think about that. But they're dead. He said, but one thing survived. He said, the blueprints for all the prototypes. And this sounds like we could feed the blueprints in the PDFs of the tool and get running again. And a lot of the intelligence that was in the heads of the people I killed would be in those blueprints, too difficult to access manually. So I'll make a long story short. We're this week. They said, we love this, we want it. We have 5 pilot projects. One of them drones, another is military, another is just organizing themselves to talk with one another as opposed to not knowing what's going on. And we're actually, next time we talk, I'll be able to tell about small evolutionary steps. I mean, really downloading things, making sure the pilots work, then getting confidence that they go full blast with this, and then in our dreams expanding to the whole of Ukraine, military and civil, and when their peace is done, helping them rebuild the country. So, and what we did is we volunteered, Kai and I and a couple other people, we volunteered our services and the software to make this happen. I put some money on the table to pay for expenses, like clouds and stuff like that, just symbolically, really. So it was like paid. And
Mhm.
uh, we've got several volunteers. Like one volunteer is going to learn language and help everybody plan what to do with it.
Mm.
We started the planning with language 2 days ago.
Wow.
That recent thing, yeah. So I think next week we're going to continue that planning, but we're simultaneously going to take very quick evolutionary steps, day by day, and we can do it because we master the tool, we own the tool,
Yeah.
and things like that. Anyway, so keep tuned. We're not going to
Yeah.
stop the war alone, and we're not going to save Ukraine alone, but we're going to start an evolutionary process of doing our bit for real, rather than
Yeah.
just saying we sympathize with you.
Yeah. Now, is that something a month from now you think you may be able to give us an update on whether it's been proved
I,
out,
I,
or is it going to be a few
I
months before you
no,
really know?
well, the rate things are going, I'll certainly have an interesting progress report next time. If I don't, I'll be sorely disappointed. But we all agree we need to. I'll put it this way: last Monday, the senior people in Ukraine, professors of technology style people. They heard a pitch by Kai about what this is all about, and they said right away, "We love this. We need it. We know what it is." In fact, in Ukraine, they even tried to build something similar before COVID, but they ran, the war. So they knew what it was and they knew how good it was, but they never had the war started, so they couldn't finish it. They have a funny for it.
Yeah.
So they saw this is what we dreamt about, So on that Monday, they all said, "We want to do this. We're going to go away and meet in committee and decide what to do, and we'll be back in 10 days." Well, on Wednesday last week, they got back and said, "Here are the 5 projects. Let's go."
They were waiting for the new pope to be announced. That was the blocker.
Yeah. So I mean, but so they are extremely keen on moving fast, as fast as humanly possible. I do things like I'll work all night to get something done for the next day. I'm not going to delay, 5,000 lives a day in Ukraine, kind of thing. So but I expect we'll be able to tell. Nothing is secret about what we're doing, so I expect I'll be able to tell you what's going on, one way or the other.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
A little news report. Yeah, I'm. We're going to use Planguage. Planguage is both how we're going to plan what we're going to do with the tool, but Planguage is also built into the tool. That's how I got to know Fred Gibson, who is the genius behind this. He read my competitive engineering book and said, "I love your way of thinking." So it's already, he and Kai have built Planguage into the tool to a degree. By the way, this is real beyond LLM artificial intelligence.
It's much more
Fred
semantic.
Gibson,
right.
He's one of Fred Gibson, who is building the whole damn thing in Lisp, would you believe? And he's an architect by training. He hates, like you mentioned earlier, he hates LLMs and everything there. And he hates it when they even hint that they have some intelligence there at all, except, cut and paste. So, but, okay. Yeah, so willing to, that's the, by the way, other little snippets of news. I've added 2 chapters to, at least, I probably added 4 chapters to my strategy ring book. And I could, just, I won't even mention what they are, but they're interesting add-ons. If you get the Dropbox link that I've sent out to you guys earlier.
Can you just give us a teaser of the chapter titles?
Okay. One chapter title is that to prove that Planguage is a visualization language par excellence. Now, this cropped up because we were looking at a thing called Wardley mapping. If you've ever heard of it, you can look it up. And it's a guy called Simon Wardley behind it, who I've met and talked to. We like each other. But there was an AI or LLM comparison of Simon Wardley as a way of thinking about strategy and Gilb. Right. And it pointed out that, well, Wardley has an edge on you, Tom, there, because he's all about visualization of the strategy and the positions. Right. And I felt a little bit insulted. And I realized that I'd fed my book into the AI, but it cannot yet read the diagrams with all the visualizations. So it's ignorant. It doesn't know I have them. So long story short, I wrote a whole chapter on the visualization capabilities of Planguage, if anybody wants to know. And a lot of people don't know that because they think of me as the guy with all the numbers and engineering.
The tables,
Think of, but it turns out tables are an excellent way of visualizing a 10 by 10 situation, matrix. Okay. Anyway, so that's number one. Then I wrote a chapter on, there's a guy called Roger L. Martin. And he is the most famous strategist. He's the popular one. He worked at Harvard a long time. He's published 20 articles in Harvard Business Review. And one of my friends said, "Tom, everywhere I go to my students and clients, they've all fallen in love with Roger Martin as the strategy man. And you and I know he hasn't got anything going for him. It's like selling Agile, which has nothing, which is very successful for 20 years. So, it's a snake oil salesman." And so I said, what are we going to do? Shall we, challenge him on the field and beat the shit out of him? I said, no, 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 no,
Do
no.
the Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg cage match, right?
Yes. So I said, no, no, it's politically smarter to say, look, you guys, your top management has bought into Roger L. Martin, and we wouldn't want to tell them they're idiots for doing that. That might get you fired. What we're going to do, I wrote a whole chapter in the book that if you believe in Roger L. Martin's wonderful ideas, here's what you do step by step in language to make it work. That's the whole chapter on that. How do you try to turn around an idiotic thing without challenging it directly and getting yourself into trouble with the top managers? Now, there's another chapter in my competitive engineering book. You'll find a thing I picked up from IBM, from my friends there, Watts Humphrey and Ron Radis. Watts Humphrey founded the Software Engineering Institute in Carnegie Mellon, by the way, and so did Ron. That's who they are there. Ron lives, Watts died. But anyway, they had a thing called ETX or ETVX sometimes. Now, this is a way of organizing any process which says, before you start doing a very expensive whatever, it's going to take a lot of people a lot of time, why don't you check that the conditions are right for avoiding failure? And that's maybe a 1 hour check, right? And if conditions are not right, don't start and waste 6 months. Very good advice, okay? And by the way, when you think you're done with the 6 month process, you're going to hand it off to somebody else who's going to do a 1 year process. Why don't you have a process called exit condition process, where you check that the conditions that what you've done is good, clean, high quality, whatever, before you check it. You don't say, we're done and we're exhausted, here it is, throw it over the wall. You say, check that it's really good enough to work well in all the succeeding processes. That's called an exit process, and it checks a set of exit criteria. Right. Well, anyway, long story short, that you'll find that all over my competitive engineering book. I've used it to describe all the process there. But I wrote a whole chapter on it because it can be used at any level of process, from the top management level, which I illustrate, down to the most detailed, say, product management things, as ways of not only controlling the process, but the interesting thing is a way of doing process improvement and getting better by changing the things you check. Make a long story short. Okay. Then I did a. I've got 2 more chapters just done in the last week. I did a new chapter I called Value Improvement. And value improvement, I said, look, this strategy thing that's been around for the last 50 years or so, all the managers learned, it's a bunch of bullshit. And I've spent most of my book saying how it might be improved and fighting it. But let's just imagine that it's got a lot of baggage of bad ideas, like North Stars and things like that. Let's take clean slate. Let's dump it entirely. We don't even breathe the word strategy because it's baggage and problems. And I'm going to invent something new to do the same thing, which is to plan high-level, long-term things. And I'm going to call it VI, value improvement, because, by the way, this strategy thing was never about strategies. It was always about improving values, and strategy was a secondary tool for doing it. So they literally named strategy the wrong name and got people focused on the means instead of the ends. Major fault. Okay, but then there are 20 to 30 other faults. So I wrote a whole chapter, which is, you guys can on how I would reinvent strategy from scratch if I could, which I did. Okay. And then there's one last chapter, and it's called Strategy Silliness. And I simply go into depth, like, maybe 50 different points about things that people are taught by Harvard Business School, etc., and Roger Martin in doing strategies which are total destructive bullshit, and they shouldn't be allowed. And the board of directors should forbid them. So I'm, very systematically what's wrong with all this shit. So that's the book, and you can read it, and I can tell you more about it if you decide what time on it. Yesterday I I was in contact with people from the American Society of Quality, ASQ, right? And people who write books for them and hold courses for them and things like that. And they pointed out to me something called Quality 4.0. Okay. Written 2019, probably, yeah, by a guy called Watson, who lives in Finland. But now this is related to something called Industry 4.0, which is the new what comes after computers and automation of the last 50 years, right? And so
The fourth
quality for
industrial revolution, I guess, is the term, which is tied
that's right.
into AI
That's
and
right.
IoT and all the stuff
That's
that's
right.
happened in the last
Yeah.
5 years.
So quality 4.0, that's the American Quality Association, ASQ, yeah, American Society for Quality. That's sort of their version about what they do, which is quality. Quality, they're really in the old days with Deming and Duran and all these wonderful people, they really haven't thought about modernizing. Anyway, I got a hold of a copy of it, started looking at it, and I said, this is supposed to be the next 10 years of brilliant things, according to Watson, who wrote it, who I'm tried to contact now, in Finland, not far away from me. But it's really narrow-minded. It's all about there's a quality professional, and that's the one who's going to drive. And he's, of course, a member of the ASQ. So they're sort of very and quality is all about reducing variation, a la Deming. There's no idea like you design quality and like Musk does. No idea at all. So I said, boy, you guys are so obsolete, it's sick, and your whole society is based on it. So long story short, yesterday I offered a few of my friends, including one in the ASQ, to hold a lecture called Quality 5.0, the new version, where we systematically reject everything written 5 years ago and the new thing. Now, long story short, that lecture is accepted and will happen with the ASQ people in September. And I think I'm also going to do it with the British Computer Society. Quality people are very interested. But
See whether they stone you.
Yeah. By the way, I put this paper on my LinkedIn site. You can easily get it there to take a simple, Gilb Quality 5.0 LinkedIn. I'm maybe not through writing the paper. In fact, I have a little bit more research. There's a guy called Zach who's written some papers on it that I have to go through. And it's only about 6 pages. But one thing it does, it takes the definitions, among others, from Duran and Philip Crosby, both of whom I met, and they're using these definitions as major pillars in the American Society for Quality, right? And these definitions they have in their official glossary, are just shit. I spent a whole page with about 50 lines decimating the definitions, even from these gurus, about why they were really narrow-minded, stupid ideas. So in a sense, I've gone up against the establishment, equality establishment in America and the world.
All right.
With my paper. Anyway, so that's the news.
All right.
Take a look.
You got a couple minutes left.
If you have trouble getting any of this, just let me know and I'll send it over. But I've told you where you can get it.
Yeah, I appreciate the Ernest. Any closing thoughts before we wrap up?
Yeah, before we even do that, how do we export the chat? I can. You mean?
They changed the UI to make it really hard to find.
Right. Okay. These companies, I don't.
By the way, excuse me if I have a meeting in 1 minute and I hate to be late like you, Ernie.
Yeah.
Although I was late to our meeting today, excuse me. I had a choice between peeing and going to the meeting on time.
TMI. We don't know. Okay.
Bye.
I will save the chat and get it to you somehow. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is incredibly annoying. It's in the top triple dot menu instead of at the bottom where it used to be.
Same. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
I'll include it in the notes or whatever. Anyway, we have a couple minutes. We can wrap up. The thing that Yeah, go ahead. Any thoughts?
Uh, Ratcheting, all that got me, I saw all these kept other ideas, but this is the big idea that I was keeping in my head. We have a lot of ratchets throughout the world. Every country is a ratchet, every community is a ratchet, all of that. Um, and what's a little disconcerting is that, at least in this country, we are on ratcheting. All those advances in government that we have made are being on ratcheted. Luckily, we still have one big one good piece, which is the judicial branch. That's the one branch that is kind of holding the rest of the system afloat for the most part right now. Because if it wasn't for that, it, we will be done.
Right. If we got there's a manifold prediction betting market on will Trump openly defy a judicial order, before, because like, and uh, it is certainly conceivable that that could happen. And at that point, then, the system of rule of law that we understand could be deeply compromised, right? And the it's thinking about how we got here and the different roles. Um, the uh, the pessimistic optimistic view take on that is all systems have to adapt in order to survive, but eventually those adaptations result in the organism losing cohesion. Right?
Mm,
Think about empires. Right? Is that the Roman Republic, was falling apart? It had to become an empire in order to survive. It survived. Most of what we think of as the Roman Empire, it was, happened after Julius Caesar took over, and that's, all the colonization of Europe and the common laws and all these things, happened in the empire, not during the Republic. Um, and the Pax Romana, and the empire was rotting to the core, but that laid the foundation for everything we consider civilization today. Is those bones. And the thing that I actually found most interesting of what uh, um, Tom shared was that, even though the people who built this stuff died, they left enough of their learnings around that we can reconstruct that and rebuild it faster. And that was actually what was the phrase? He said, "You are so obsolete it is sick, and your whole society is based on it." I feel that way about America sometimes.
mm,
Is that the Enlightenment ideals that, Jefferson, the slave owner, talked about, the equality of all men, like the inherent blind hypocrisy that was at the very root of America's founding. That was, it was a glorious hypocrisy. It really was. You know, it made us aspire to something despite the fact that we lived in the exact opposite, and it nearly killed us as a country in 1860s to resolve that contradiction. Is that there's all sorts of those contradictions that I see in our society and our values and our laws. And it's not unlike the emotion you have as like, I feel all this stuff, including love for my country, but to put into words and justify it feels almost like it cheapens it.
mm,
And the idea that, maybe the best we can hope for is to learn from our mistakes. We can't prevent them. One thing you learn with kids is there certain mistakes you can't prevent. If you can just delay it, or worse, you can make people hide it. So then when it erupts, it's even worse. But if you have the intestinal fortitude to let the mistakes happen, but create a context where you can learn from them, that's how you ratchet your way forward.
mm,
And it's hard, right? There's a lot of America, that I mean, like, Trump unwinding the global trade order, that, it's not as bad now as it looked like it was going to be last week, but who knows how it's going to play out. But, the naive belief we had in the 90s and early 2000s that if China gets rich, they'll become a good liberal democracy, that is not happening. And we would prefer to avoid facing that fact for good reasons. But it takes a lunatic like Trump to force you to face this reality. And rather than bemoaning, let's embrace the lesson. And how do we design a system so we don't have to wait for unhinged lunatics to tell us blatant truths that the wise elites prefer to suppress? And the themes that you've been talking about transparency and immutable public records, like that's like the blueprints in the bombed out garage. If we can at least keep track of our failed experiments and noble attempts that went awry, then maybe the next generation can use all these tools to learn from that and do better.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
that's
that's a pessimistically optimistic take on our moment.
yeah, and yeah, I hope that we can evolve from the one mind type of leader to what the Datocracy wants,
Yeah,
everybody.
yeah, and it's Scott Alexander said it best, is that the Republicans have become a cult of personality, but that's because the Democrats had become a cult of institutions.
Mm,
Right? As long as you get the right credentials, like, and you respect the people who have the credentials, then you're doing the right thing. And that's what led to Biden becoming nearly senile and nobody wanting to say anything, is that they were clinging to the cult of institutions because they did not want to become a cult of personality. And fascinating. I have a friend who's a follower of Egan, the education philosopher, and his fantasy is a world full of learning freaks where people and like what's the alternative of a cult of personality and a cult of institutions? Maybe it's a cult of learning that we are obsessed over is making sure that we at least learn from our mistakes and write that down so the next time around we at least have the opportunity to do better, as
yes,
opposed to covering up our mistakes and trying to make ourselves look good or defend our earlier positions. Like,
exactly what the Republicans want to do. They want to erase history, write it according
right.
to
And you know where they learned that from?
uh, I guess what Hitler.
The left.
The- really?
Yeah, is that the the rage of the left in the 60s was to say, screw government, screw authority, the world is unjust. We need to focus on all the things that are wrong and diss anything that was done right. And the
Oh,
left systematically said, like, let's like this is the brutal thing, right? Is it's like, let's forget about the letter of the law, let's forget about tradition, let's treat the Constitution as a living document where we decide what is right. And Trump weaponized that. So it's like, fine, you want to reinterpret the Constitution and ignore social norms? Let me show you how it's done. And all the liberals are screaming, hey, we have norms, we have standards, we have tradition, we have precedent. We should really respect that. It's like, it's like I understand why the left did it, but then I understand why the right did it back. It's like, we would really like tradition when we see something we value being undermined. But we hate tradition when we see it condoning something that we find intolerable. And everyone draws that line in different places.
mm,
And this is where I kind of land is like, there's a lot of things that I value and cherish that are gone, you know? Um, and there's also a lot of things that I deeply despised, which are also gone. And I have to come to grips with that reality. And this really is the same question I was dealing with at work last week is like, what is my identity in? And so the idea of a cult of learning, including learning from our own mistakes, and especially learning from the things we find most despicable and most intolerable,
mm.
is how we outcompete the cults of personality and the cults of institution. By saying, like, I will learn if it kills me, and I will learn if you kill me, because that's how we make the world better.
Mm. Yeah, I like this learning thing.
All
If we could
right.
institutionalize it, like, yeah.
Well, yeah. So that's a great question. Is can you build a cult of learning, and can you institutionalize learning without? I mean, dear God, we tried to institutionalize learning, and we ended up with the American educational system,
Mm,
which is notorious for its inability to learn anything about itself.
mm,
Right? And so that's a great question for next time.
yeah.
Can we institutionalize a cult or culture of learning? Because without an institution, you don't ratchet. You just
Hmm.
have great ideas that disappear. But with institution, you ossify.
Mm.
Is you can learn anything except how to question the institution, right?
Well,
And as a Christian
you
living in the 21st
inspire.
century, I have hit that wall multiple times. And what's the funniest thing? I just got to share this with you. Is Christian are really big into orthodoxy and stamping out heresy. Do you know
Mm,
what the most common use of the word heresy in the New Testament is?
uh,
It's to describe the followers of Jesus.
that's heresy?
The word, yes, because heresy just means a group of people committed to a cause. The four times it refers to the followers of Jesus, two times it refers to just political parties or religious parties in Judaism, and three times it's used for divisive behavior within the church. And
Okay.
so, perversely, orthodoxy, as we have defined it, is technically a heresy because it divides people between the Orthodox and the non Orthodox. And this is like deeply embedded in the fabric of Christianity. And there's a similar paradox in the way we treat education, where education is, you know, um, it's really designed for indoctrination more than it's designed for learning. And so everyone who tries to be more progressive and more inclusive and more experimental, they just end up thrashing against the system and wondering why. And this is, I think, a great place for another Tom quote is like, okay, if you find that you're not making forward progress, you have to question the architecture. And the architect, and this is something I've been having lots of discussions with different people in the education reform community. And I think that'll be a great conversation next time is, can we institutionalize a cult of learning? And how do you actually do that when you have to, in some sense, normalize heresy?
Mm,
Uh, because it's precisely the heretics that are the greatest source of innovation. And by the way, that's the other thing that I thought that you're great at, which Tom undervalued with this talk about a ratchet. If I can make small, meaningful progress and capture something, but the other thing that you can do is to be a glorious failure. Like think of Joan of Arc, right? Or John Brown, the anti-slavery advocate. People
mm,
who try to do something way ahead of their time. Or I watched the Magic Leap um, video about everyone in the early 1990s who was trying to build the iPhone. And they made lots of mistakes, but they were doomed to fail because they were trying to be too far ahead of where battery power and computing power. They didn't even have the internet back then. Right? They had no idea what mobile communication would be good for. They didn't have the web, rather. And so, but it was an extraordinary training ground and inspiration. And all these people, Andy Rubin, Tony Fadell, came out of that to build the iPod and Android and Safari and all this sort of stuff. And so, there's a space for incremental improvement, but there's a place for glorious public failure that inspires the next generation.
I'm thinking of what's her name? The Theranos woman.
That was a
Failure is your
spectacular
club.
failure. I don't know that. Yeah, that was just. So let me use a better phrase: generative failure.
Mm,
Right? It's where you try something beautiful that fails, but it seeds something even better after it. And it's because is that you failed in a way that everyone learns from it,
Mhm.
right? As opposed to where you do myth making and rewrite history to pretend that you didn't make any mistakes.
Mhm.
And
Elon
that's
Musk.
part of cult. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if in his own, because like certainly they've made god awful numbers of mistakes. I don't know. I actually don't know whether he learns from it. I suspect he privately learns from mistakes, even if he publicly doesn't acknowledge them. Um, but well, that's not true. I think he has certain personality characteristics that he just defends because they're adjacent to useful skills that he doesn't want to lose. And I think we all do that. Um, but the systems he built do tend to learn pretty fast. The ones that survive.
Yeah,
And
his rockets that appear to be really good.
and they're getting and they started out bad, but they got better faster than everybody else.
Yeah, but they start bad because they don't care about being bad, right? They
Yes.
put it until it blows. That's fine. That's what we want to know. We want to know what's the limit. So that's
Yeah. Yeah, that's how we ran Doge. And I think when people are involved, you may want to dial your mechanistic improvement tendencies back, but you can still respect them.
hmm,
And that's the thing is most institutions define the survival of the institution as continuity, which means, don't make me look bad because that would undermine the institution. The trade unions
hmm,
in Tom's example, right? Those are the people who keep management from totally exploiting the workers, and they only do that by maintaining their moral authority. But then they use their moral authority in ways that sabotages the success of the business.
hmm,
It's a tragedy, but it's not clear what the alternative is, other than actually building trusting relationships with each other where we can be vulnerable enough to fail and learn. And that is fiendishly difficult, but I think that's what a culture of learning looks like. A cult of learning, actually, more than just a culture of learning. It's a cult of learning where you obsess over this even in ways that seem irrational and self-defeating. That's what it means to be a cult, right? And and that's the thing. Can we institutionalize a cult of learning, and would that be a good thing? It's a great question for next time.
yeah. Okay.
All right.
I'll work on it.
All right.
All right, Ernie.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Ernest.